April 16, 1945. 04:30 hours, the Kremlin, Moscow. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov stood before a massive oak table covered with detailed maps of Berlin, his weathered hands gripping the edges as he stared down at Joseph Stalin. The Georgian dictator sat motionless, his yellow eyes fixed on the marshal who had just committed what many would consider professional suicide. Minutes earlier, Zhukov had taken the General Staff's carefully crafted methodical plan for the assault on Berlin and literally torn it in half. The sound of ripping paper still echoed in the silence of the war room. Stalin's pipe smoke curled upward in the dim light, creating ghostly patterns that seemed to mirror the tension filling the space between the two most powerful men in the Soviet Union. What happened next would determine not just the fate of Berlin, but potentially the entire post-war balance of power in Europe. The plan Zhukov had destroyed called for a systematic 3-week siege that would minimize Soviet casualties. The plan Zhukov was about to propose would put 5 million Red Army soldiers directly into the meat grinder of the most fortified city in Nazi Germany, with the promise that he could take it in just 8 days. The relationship between Stalin and Zhukov had always been a delicate dance between paranoia and necessity. Since 1941, when Zhukov had saved Moscow from German panzers, the marshal had been the one field commander Stalin couldn't afford to eliminate, despite his growing suspicion of military leaders who achieved too much success. By April 1945, Zhukov commanded the largest concentration of military power in Soviet history. His first Belarusian front controlled over 900 Syrazuzaran men, 12 Thirazad and artillery pieces, 500 tanks, and 400 aircraft. He was, in every practical sense, more powerful than many heads of state. This reality terrified Stalin, who had spent the previous 4 years systematically eliminating or transferring any general who showed signs of independent thinking. Yet Berlin remained unconquered, and the Western allies were advancing rapidly from the west. Churchill and Roosevelt were already positioning their forces for maximum post-war advantage, and Stalin knew that whoever reached Berlin first would control the narrative of victory. The General Staff's plan, developed by a committee of seasoned officers led by General Antonov, reflected traditional Soviet military doctrine. It called for massive artillery bombardments followed by methodical infantry advances, using overwhelming force to grind down German resistance street by street, building by building. The plan estimated 18 to 21 days for complete conquest, with projected casualties of approximately 250 Alozelaran Soviet soldiers. The numbers were sobering but acceptable by Soviet standards. More importantly, the plan virtually guaranteed success with minimal risk of catastrophic failure that could embarrass the Soviet Union on the world stage. Zhukov had studied this plan for 3 days and concluded it was a recipe for disaster, not because it wouldn't work, but because it would work too slowly. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces were collapsing faster than anticipated across all fronts. American and British forces were advancing toward Berlin at unprecedented speed, with some units already crossing the Elbe River. If the Red Army spent 3 weeks systematically reducing Berlin, they risked arriving to find Western forces already installed in key positions throughout the city. The political implications were staggering. Stalin had made it clear that Berlin represented the crown jewel of Soviet victory, the ultimate proof that the USSR had borne the heaviest burden in destroying Nazi Germany. To share that prize with capitalist allies would be ideologically and strategically unacceptable. The dictator's mood had grown increasingly dark as reports arrived of American units advancing unopposed through regions Stalin considered rightfully Soviet spheres of influence. The previous week, he had erupted in fury when informed that British forces had captured intact German research facilities that should have fallen to Soviet units. Now, with Berlin within reach, any delay could result in a repetition of that humiliation, on a scale that would undermine Soviet prestige for generations. The scene in the Kremlin war room that April morning represented the culmination of months of growing tension between political necessity and military caution. Present alongside Stalin and Zhukov were Defense Minister Rodion Malinovsky, General Staff Chief Alexei Antonov, and NKVD Chief Lavrentiy Beria. The atmosphere was suffocating with cigarette smoke and the weight of historical moment. Maps covered every available surface, showing German defensive positions, Soviet unit locations, and projected advance routes. Red pins indicated confirmed enemy strong points, while blue arrows traced the proposed Soviet offensive operations. The most prominent map displayed Berlin itself, a maze of streets, bridges, and fortified positions that had been transformed into the most heavily defended city in human history. German engineers had spent months converting apartment buildings into fortresses, creating killing fields from major boulevards, and installing artillery positions in subway tunnels. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had promised that Berlin would become the graveyard of Bolshevism, and German defenders were prepared to make that promise reality through street-to-street combat that would maximize Soviet casualties. When Zhukov reached across the table and tore the general staff plan in half, the sound seemed amplified in the silence. Antonov's face went white, Malinovsky's jaw dropped, and even Beria showed surprise. Stalin's expression remained completely neutral, but his fingers drummed slowly against his pipe. The dictator had witnessed this kind of theatrical gesture from Zhukov before, most notably before the Battle of Kursk, when the marshal had similarly rejected conventional wisdom in favor of a more aggressive approach. That gamble had resulted in the greatest tank battle in history and the beginning of Germany's inevitable retreat. But this was different. Kursk had been fought in open countryside, where Soviet advantages in numbers and production could be fully utilized. Berlin was urban warfare, the most unpredictable and costly form of combat, where small groups of determined defenders could hold up entire armies for weeks. The mathematical precision that had served Soviet forces well in previous campaigns became meaningless when every building could hide anti-tank weapons and every intersection could become a killing zone. If you want to discover how one marshal's 8-day gamble changed the course of post-war Europe, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. We rescue stories like this from the archives every day. The plan Zhukov proposed to replace the General Staff's methodical approach represented everything Stalin both admired and feared about his most successful commander. Instead of the careful, systematic advance that would take 3 weeks, Zhukov outlined a concentrated assault that would penetrate Berlin's defenses in multiple locations simultaneously, creating chaos and confusion that would prevent German commanders from organizing effective resistance. The key insight was psychological rather than tactical. German morale was collapsing, and Hitler's regime was disintegrating from within. Rather than giving enemy forces time to organize desperate last-ditch defenses, Zhukov proposed to overwhelm them with such massive simultaneous pressure that resistance would crumble faster than it could be reinforced. The marshal spread a new map across the table, this one marked with red arrows converging on Berlin from 3 directions simultaneously. His plan called for the 1st Belarusian front to attack directly across the Oder River, while Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian front struck from the south and Marshal Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian front approached from the north. The audacity of the proposal was breathtaking. Zhukov was essentially gambling with the largest military force in Soviet history, proposing to commit every available reserve to a single massive assault that would either capture Berlin in 8 days or result in catastrophic casualties that would cripple the Red Army's ability to maintain control over occupied territories. Stalin listened without interruption as Zhukov outlined the details, his voice growing more confident as he explained how German defensive positions could be neutralized through concentrated artillery barrages, followed immediately by tank-supported infantry assaults. The marshal had identified specific weaknesses in Berlin's fortifications, particularly in the southern approaches where bombing had created gaps in the defensive lines. More importantly, he had developed a new tactical doctrine that combined lessons learned from 4 years of urban combat, from Stalingrad to Budapest. Soviet forces would advance in small, mixed units of infantry, engineers, and armor, each capable of independent action, but coordinated through radio communications that had been perfected during recent campaigns. This approach would prevent the kind of massive traffic jams that had plagued earlier urban operations, while maintaining enough flexibility to exploit unexpected opportunities or respond to unexpected threats. The political dimensions of Zhukov's proposal were as important as the military aspects. The Marshal understood that speed was not just operationally important, but strategically crucial. Every day the Red Army spent besieging Berlin was another day for Western forces to advance deeper into what Stalin considered the Soviet sphere of influence. More significantly, a quick victory would demonstrate Soviet military superiority in a way that would influence post-war negotiations. Churchill and Roosevelt were already beginning to question whether continued cooperation with Stalin was in Western interests, and a dramatic military success would strengthen the Soviet negotiating position in discussions about occupied territories, war reparations, and the structure of post-war Europe. Zhukov had studied the political implications as carefully as the military ones, and his proposal represented a calculated risk that could either secure Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe or destroy the Red Army's ability to maintain control over territories they had already conquered. The stakes could not have been higher, and everyone in the room understood that this decision would echo through history for generations. Stalin's response came after nearly 10 minutes of complete silence. The dictator stood slowly, walked to the window overlooking Red Square, and stared out at the fortress walls that had protected Moscow for centuries. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet but carried absolute authority. "Comrade Marshal," he said without turning around, "your plan is either brilliant or insane. Perhaps both." The room remained silent as Stalin continued. "The General Staff believes their approach will guarantee victory with acceptable losses. You believe your approach will guarantee victory with minimal time. The question is not which plan will work. The question is which plan serves the interests of the Soviet Union." He turned back to face Zhukov directly. "You have 8 days. If you fail, you will be held personally responsible for every Soviet soldier who dies unnecessarily. If you succeed, you will have earned a place in history alongside the greatest military commanders of all time." The meeting had lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would reshape Europe. How many of you have a grandfather, a father, an uncle who served and never spoke about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment now saying simply, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family. You're preserving memory for the next generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. The implementation of Zhukov's plan began immediately, with orders flowing through the military hierarchy to commanders who had spent weeks preparing for the methodical approach outlined in the original General Staff strategy. The sudden change created confusion and resistance at multiple levels, as division and regiment commanders struggled to reorganize their units for the more aggressive timeline. Artillery officers who had calculated ammunition requirements for a 3-week campaign now faced demands to deliver the same firepower in 1/3 the time. Tank commanders who had planned careful maintenance schedules to keep their vehicles operational throughout an extended siege suddenly needed to prepare for intensive combat that would push their machinery beyond normal operational limits. Supply officers faced the nightmare scenario of supporting maximum combat intensity while simultaneously advancing their logistics networks across difficult terrain under enemy fire. The complexity of coordinating such a massive military operation under compressed timelines tested every system the Red Army had developed throughout the war. Zhukov's tactical innovations became apparent as his subordinate commanders received detailed operational instructions. Rather than the traditional Soviet approach of massed frontal assaults, the Marshal had developed a doctrine of simultaneous penetrations, designed to create multiple crises that would overwhelm German defensive capabilities. Soviet forces would advance along 17 different axes, each supported by concentrated artillery and close air support, but each also capable of independent operation if other attacks faltered. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. German commanders would face simultaneous threats from multiple directions, making it impossible to concentrate reserves effectively or establish stable defensive lines. Engineering units received special attention in Zhukov's planning, with combat engineers assigned to lead elements of every attacking formation. These specialists carried flamethrowers, explosive charges, and specialized equipment for urban warfare that had been developed through bitter experience in cities like Stalingrad and Berlin. Their mission was to neutralize German strongpoints quickly, allowing following infantry to maintain momentum rather than becoming bogged down in prolonged firefights around individual buildings. Tank units received modified ammunition loads emphasizing high explosive rounds for destroying fortifications, rather than armor-piercing rounds for fighting other tanks, reflecting Zhukov's assessment that German armored reserves were too weak to pose significant threats to properly supported Soviet advances. The artillery component of Zhukov's plan represented the largest concentration of firepower in military history up to that point. Over 12 Duo-Sauer guns, mortars, and rocket launchers were positioned along the front lines, with ammunition stocks calculated to deliver continuous fire support for 8 days of intensive combat. Soviet artillery doctrine had evolved significantly since the early disasters of 1941, incorporating lessons learned from successful operations like the destruction of German forces at Stalingrad and the breakthrough at Kursk. Forward observers were equipped with radio communications that allowed real-time coordination between attacking infantry and supporting artillery, dramatically improving the accuracy and effectiveness of fire support. Counter-battery operations received special emphasis, with Soviet units trained to locate and destroy German artillery positions before they could disrupt Soviet advances. The scale was overwhelming even by Soviet standards, with some sectors planned to receive more artillery support per kilometer than any previous operation in military history. The logistical challenges of supplying this level of firepower required massive transportation efforts, with trains, trucks, and even horse-drawn wagons moving ammunition to forward positions throughout the weeks leading up to the assault. Air support represented another crucial component of Zhukov's compressed timeline strategy. Soviet air forces had achieved clear superiority over the German Luftwaffe by April 1945, with over 1,400 aircraft assigned to support the Berlin operation. Close air support aircraft received specific training in urban warfare tactics, learning to coordinate with ground forces advancing through city streets while avoiding damage to infrastructure that would be needed for post-war reconstruction. Fighter aircraft were tasked with maintaining air superiority and intercepting any remaining German aircraft attempting to support defensive operations. Bomber units received targets including German command posts, ammunition depots, and transportation networks that could be used to move reserves or evacuate Nazi leadership. The coordination between air and ground forces represented a level of sophistication that the Red Army had spent years developing, with radio communications and standardized procedures that allowed aircraft to respond to changing tactical situations in real time. Soviet pilots understood that their mission extended beyond simple fire support to include psychological warfare designed to break German morale through demonstrations of overwhelming power. Intelligence operations played a crucial role in Zhukov's planning, with Soviet reconnaissance units providing detailed information about German defensive positions, troop movements, and morale conditions. Partisan networks operating behind German lines had been feeding information to Soviet commanders for months, creating detailed maps of Berlin's fortifications and identifying key targets for special operations. Soviet agents had infiltrated German communication networks, providing real-time intelligence about enemy plans and dispositions that would be crucial for exploiting opportunities during the assault. Counterintelligence operations focused on preventing German forces from learning about Soviet preparations, with elaborate deception measures designed to conceal the true scale and timing of the planned offensive. Radio communications were carefully controlled to prevent German monitoring stations from determining Soviet unit locations or operational plans. The intelligence picture that emerged showed German forces in Berlin were more demoralized and poorly supplied than many Soviet commanders had realized, supporting Zhukov's assessment that aggressive action could achieve quick victory with lower casualties than a prolonged siege. The political pressures surrounding the Berlin operation intensified as the date for Zhukov's assault approached. Stalin received daily updates on Western Allied advances, with reports showing American and British forces moving faster than Soviet intelligence had predicted. The race to Berlin had become a race for post-war political advantage, with each side understanding that military positions at the end of the war would determine diplomatic positions during peace negotiations. Soviet diplomatic representatives in Washington and London reported growing Western suspicion of Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe, with Churchill in particular advocating for more aggressive Allied advances to limit Soviet territorial gains. These political considerations reinforced Stalin's decision to support Zhukov's aggressive timeline, despite the military risks involved. The dictator understood that a dramatic Soviet victory in Berlin would strengthen his position in negotiations about occupied territories, war reparations, and the structure of post-war international organizations. The alternative, arriving in Berlin to find Western forces already established in key positions, would represent a strategic defeat that could undermine Soviet influence for decades. The final preparations for Zhukov's assault revealed the massive scale of resources the Soviet Union was prepared to commit to capturing Berlin. Over 1.5 million soldiers were positioned along the front lines, representing the largest military force ever assembled for a single operation. Tank units included the newest Soviet models, with T-34-85s and IS-3 heavy tanks that outclassed remaining German armor in both numbers and capability. Artillery concentrations reached levels that exceeded even Stalingrad, with some sectors receiving fire support from guns positioned wheel to wheel along kilometers of front line. Supply networks stretched back hundreds of kilometers to Soviet industrial centers, carrying ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies for forces that would consume resources at unprecedented rates during intensive urban combat. Medical units prepared for massive casualties, with field hospitals positioned to handle both Soviet wounded and German civilians caught in the fighting. The scale of preparation reflected both Soviet industrial capacity and the political importance Stalin attached to quick victory in Berlin. April 16, 1945, marked the beginning of what would become known as the Battle of Berlin, but also the vindication of Zhukov's strategic gamble. At precisely 0500 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire along the entire front, delivering a bombardment that could be heard in Prague, 200 kilometers away. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating, with many positions abandoned before Soviet infantry even began their advance. Zhukov's tactical innovations proved effective from the first hours of combat, with multiple penetrations creating the confusion and chaos he had predicted. German commanders found themselves unable to coordinate effective resistance as their communication networks were disrupted, and their reserve units were committed to multiple simultaneous crises. By the end of the first day, Soviet forces had advanced deeper into Berlin than the General Staff's plan had projected for the first week of operations. The compressed timeline was working exactly as Zhukov had promised, with German resistance collapsing faster than reinforcements could be organized. The urban combat that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Zhukov's planning and the brutal reality of modern warfare in densely populated areas. Soviet assault teams moved through Berlin's streets with tactics perfected through years of urban fighting, using engineers to clear buildings, while infantry provided covering fire and tanks destroyed fortified positions. German resistance was fierce but uncoordinated, with individual units fighting desperately, while lacking the central command structure needed for effective defense. The speed of Soviet advances prevented German forces from establishing stable defensive lines, forcing them into a series of desperate retreats that left behind equipment, ammunition, and supplies that Soviet units captured intact. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery was shelling the Reich Chancellery itself, demonstrating the rapid progress of Zhukov's assault. The psychological impact extended beyond military considerations, as German civilians and military personnel alike began to realize that the war was truly ending, and that continued resistance would only increase their suffering. The final days of the Battle of Berlin showcased the complete vindication of Zhukov's strategy against conventional military wisdom. On April 25th, Soviet units from different fronts linked up in Berlin's center, completing the encirclement of remaining German forces and eliminating any possibility of organized resistance. Hitler's suicide on April 30th marked the effective end of Nazi Germany, occurring exactly 14 days after Zhukov's assault began. The Marshal had not only met his 8-day deadline for breaking German resistance, but had accelerated the collapse of the entire Nazi regime. German forces throughout Europe began surrendering as news of Berlin's fall spread, creating a cascade of victories that exceeded even Stalin's most optimistic projections. The speed of victory had political consequences that justified the military risks Zhukov had taken, with Soviet forces occupying key positions throughout Eastern Europe before Western allies could establish competing claims. The aftermath of Berlin's capture revealed the full scope of Zhukov's achievement and its implications for post-war Europe. Soviet casualties were significantly lower than projected in either the original General Staff plan or Zhukov's own estimates, totaling approximately 125 rather than the 250 anticipated for a prolonged siege. The rapid victory had prevented German forces from implementing their planned destruction of Berlin's infrastructure, leaving intact bridges, power plants, and transportation networks that would prove crucial for post-war reconstruction. More importantly, from Stalin's perspective, the dramatic Soviet victory provided powerful propaganda that reinforced claims about the USSR's decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. The image of Soviet soldiers raising the red flag over the Reich Chancellery became one of the most powerful symbols of the war, demonstrating Soviet strength in a way that strengthened Stalin's position in negotiations with Western allies about post-war territorial arrangements and political structures. Zhukov's relationship with Stalin entered a new phase following the Berlin victory, marked by both increased respect and increased suspicion. The Marshal had proven his tactical brilliance beyond any doubt, but had also demonstrated an independence of thought that made the paranoid dictator uncomfortable. Stalin understood that Zhukov's success made him extremely popular among Soviet military personnel and potentially a political threat if he ever chose to challenge party authority. The solution was characteristic of Stalin's approach to managing successful subordinates. Zhukov received public honors and private warnings, with promotions accompanied by assignments that kept him away from Moscow and the center of political power. The Marshal became a symbol of Soviet military excellence, while being carefully monitored by NKVD agents who reported his every word and action to Stalin personally. This dynamic would continue throughout the post-war period, with Zhukov achieving legendary status among Soviet citizens, while living under constant surveillance from the security apparatus that served the man he had helped bring to ultimate victory. The broader implications of Zhukov's Berlin strategy extended far beyond the immediate military victory, to influence Soviet military doctrine and international relations for decades. The success of rapid, concentrated assault tactics reinforced Soviet confidence in offensive operations that would shape military planning throughout the Cold War period. The demonstration of Soviet capability to mobilize massive resources and achieve dramatic victories influenced Western perceptions of Soviet power and contributed to decisions about NATO formation and nuclear weapons development. More immediately, the speed of Berlin's capture allowed Soviet forces to occupy territories in Eastern Europe that became the foundation of the Warsaw Pact alliance system. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany fell under Soviet influence partly because of the rapid military advances that Zhukov's tactics had made possible. The political map of Europe that emerged from World War II reflected military positions that were determined, in large part, by the success of the 8-day gamble that had seemed so risky in that Kremlin war room on April 16, 1945. The story of Zhukov, tearing up the safe plan and Stalin's response, illuminates fundamental truths about leadership, risk assessment, and the relationship between military success and political power. In a moment when conventional wisdom counseled caution and systematic approaches, Zhukov recognized that historical opportunities require bold action and willingness to accept significant risks for potentially transformational gains. His ability to perceive the political dimensions of military decisions demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that separates great commanders from merely competent ones. Stalin's decision to support the risky plan despite his natural paranoia showed that even authoritarian leaders must sometimes trust subordinates whose expertise exceeds their own. The dynamic between the two men reflected broader tensions in Soviet society, between centralized control and the need for independent thinking in specialized fields like military operations. Georgy Zhukov survived Stalin's post-war purges and continued serving the Soviet Union until his death in 1974, though his later career was marked by periods of exile and rehabilitation, as different Soviet leaders struggled with his legacy of independence and success. His tactical innovations in urban warfare influenced military doctrine worldwide, with armies studying the Berlin operation for lessons about rapid assault tactics and combined arms coordination. Stalin died in 1953, taking to his grave the full details of many conversations with subordinates who had shaped the course of world history. The Kremlin war room where Zhukov tore up the general staff plan was preserved as a museum, though visitors are not told the complete story of the dramatic confrontation that occurred there. Berlin was rebuilt as a divided city that became the symbol of Cold War tensions, with the rapid Soviet capture of 1945 influencing political arrangements that persisted until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The Battle of Berlin stands as testament to the proposition that in warfare, as in many human endeavors, the greatest risks sometimes yield the greatest rewards. Zhukov's willingness to tear up conventional plans and stake his reputation on an untested strategy demonstrates the kind of leadership that shapes history, rather than merely responding to it. The success of his 8-day timeline proved that understanding psychology and morale can be as important as understanding logistics and tactics, and that speed itself can become a weapon when properly employed. For modern students of leadership and strategy, the story offers insights about decision-making under extreme pressure, the importance of challenging conventional wisdom, and the delicate balance between confidence and recklessness that distinguishes successful risk-taking from mere gambling. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about generals who broke rules to save lives, soldiers who challenged the impossible, leaders who changed history with courage and creativity. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Russia, Canada, Australia, Germany. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just tell us you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Marshal Georgy Zhukov doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Educational note. This narrative combines documented historical events with educational interpretation for entertainment purposes. While the Battle of Berlin, the relationship between Stalin and Zhukov, and the strategic decisions surrounding the assault are historically documented, specific dialogue and detailed personal interactions represent educational dramatization based on historical records and accounts.